Hello, midnight wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I've rewritten and expanded your story in smooth, natural English while keeping it close to the original events, increasing the suspense and detail for a USA, UK, Canada audience. This happened several years ago when I was around 10 or 12 years old. I'm 18 now, but even after all this time, it's one of those memories that still sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. Looking back as an adult, I realized just how serious the situation could have become, and how lucky my family was that nothing worse happened that night. At the time, I lived with my parents in Norfolk, England. We lived in a neighborhood that was generally considered safe. The area was made up mostly of housing for military families, and because of that, most people felt comfortable there. Neighbors knew each other. People looked out for one another. And it wasn't the kind of place where you expected serious crime to happen. The neighborhood itself was arranged in a square-like block with several streets branching off from it. During the day, it felt friendly and normal, with children playing outside and people walking their dogs. But there was one thing about the area that always made some residents uneasy. Not far from our neighborhood was a rundown housing estate that had a bad reputation. Everyone in the area knew about it. There were constant rumors about fights, thefts, drug activity, and other problems. Whether every story was true or not, it was enough that most people avoided going there unless they absolutely had to. Because of that nearby estate, our neighborhood had several neighborhood watch signs posted around the streets. Residents tried to stay alert and keep an eye on suspicious activity. Even as a kid, I knew there was a reason those signs existed. The night this happened was during the middle of winter. Anyone who has experienced a winter evening in the UK knows how dark it can get. By late evening, the sun had long disappeared, and darkness seemed to swallow everything outside. That particular night was especially cold. The sky was black, and apart from a few widely spaced street lamps, there was very little light outside. Looking out of a window felt like staring into an endless void. My mom and I were sitting in the living room watching television. My dad was still at work and wasn't expected home for a while. The living room had a large window beside the sofa. From where I was sitting, I could easily look out onto the street. Directly across the road was a large open field. During the daytime, it wasn't anything special. Kids sometimes played there, and people occasionally walked their dogs through it. But at night, it became something completely different. The darkness would blanket the entire field, turning it into a giant black space where you couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the road. Even as a child, I always thought it looked creepy. Whenever I glanced toward it at night, I couldn't help imagining someone standing out there, watching the houses from the darkness. That evening felt completely normal. The television was on. The heating was running. My mom and I were relaxed. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, at around 9:45 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. At first, neither of us thought much of it. But then another knock followed. Our front door had a large frosted glass panel built into it. It allowed light through, but it distorted everything on the other side, making it nearly impossible to clearly identify anyone standing outside. My mom immediately became cautious. Instead of opening the door, she told me to stay back. I moved behind a nearby doorway where I could still see the front entrance while remaining mostly hidden. I remember peeking around the corner, curious to see who was outside. My mom didn't stand directly in front of the door. Instead, she positioned herself slightly to the side. Looking back, I realized she was being smart. She didn't want whoever was outside to have a clear view of her. "Who's there?" she called through the door. A male voice answered. He sounded young, maybe around 15 or 16 years old. "My phone is dead," he said. "Can I come inside and charge it?" Even as a kid, something about the request felt strange. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. It was freezing outside, and some random teenager was asking to come inside a stranger's house? My mom clearly thought the same thing. "No, sorry," she replied. "I can't do that." For a moment, there was silence. Then the boy asked again. He kept insisting. At first, he sounded calm, but with each refusal, his tone became more irritated. The longer the conversation continued, the more uncomfortable I felt. It wasn't just that he wanted help, it was the way he refused to accept the answer. Most people would have simply moved on after being told no. This boy didn't. He kept pushing. Minute after minute. My mom continued refusing. Eventually, his voice became noticeably angrier. I remember hearing frustration in the way he spoke. The entire interaction lasted somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. Then finally, he seemed to give up. I heard him sigh loudly before walking away. At least, that's what we thought. Our house had a layout that made the situation even more unsettling. Directly beside the front door was our garage. Beyond that was a dark, open field. Because of the way everything was positioned, someone could easily stand behind the garage and remain completely hidden from view. The field had no lighting, making it almost impossible to see anything there at night. My mum understood this. Just because the boy appeared to leave didn't mean he had actually gone. So she began checking the entire house. She locked every door, checked every window, made sure all chains were secured. Then she closed the blinds and curtains throughout the house. Only after everything was secured did she tell me to go to bed. At the time, I thought she was probably overreacting. Now I understand she was being careful. I went upstairs and eventually fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The house was dark and quiet. Then, I heard it. A scratching noise. It was faint, but definitely there. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I sat up in bed listening. The sound was coming from downstairs. At some point during the night, my dad had returned home from work because I could hear him snoring in my parents' bedroom. For a moment, I considered waking him. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I quietly climbed out of bed. The floor felt cold beneath my feet. Trying not to make any noise, I crept through the hallway. As I passed my parents' room, I could hear my dad sleeping peacefully. Neither of them seemed aware that anything was happening. The scratching continued. Slow, persistent, almost deliberate. I reached a window that overlooked the same area near our front door. Unfortunately, because of the small porch above the entrance, I couldn't actually see whether anyone was standing directly outside. The scratching continued. Then, I heard a slight banging noise that immediately made my stomach tighten. Someone was definitely outside. Looking back now, I know I should have gone straight to my parents. But I was a curious kid, and curiosity often overpowers common sense. Slowly, I began making my way downstairs. Each step felt louder than the last. The house remained completely silent except for the noises coming from the front door. I reached the halfway point on the staircase. Then I froze. From that position, I could see part of the entrance area, and standing directly outside the front door was a silhouette, a dark figure. Even through the frosted glass, I could make out the shape. It looked remarkably similar to the same teenager who had visited earlier. My heart immediately started racing. I checked the clock nearby. It was around 2 a.m. Why would someone return at 2 in the morning? The scratching continued. Then another quiet metallic noise. The figure appeared to be fiddling with something near the door. I stood completely still. Frozen, every instinct told me to run upstairs, but fear rooted me to the spot. For what felt like forever, I watched this stranger standing outside my home in the middle of the night. The entire situation felt unreal. The house was dark, my parents were asleep, and a stranger was attempting something at our front door. The worst part was not knowing whether he was alone. I couldn't see the field. I couldn't see behind the garage. For all I knew, several other people could have been hiding nearby, waiting, watching, ready to move if the door opened. Eventually, the noises stopped. The figure remained still for a few moments. Then, he turned and walked away. I stayed frozen for another minute just to make sure he wasn't coming back. Only after I was certain he was gone did I quietly return upstairs. I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying what I had seen: the figure, the scratching, the late-night visit. None of it felt right. The following morning, I immediately told my parents what had happened. As expected, they weren't happy. My mom was frustrated that I hadn't woken them up. My dad couldn't believe I had stood on the stairs watching a stranger instead of getting help. At the time, I felt embarrassed, but eventually, everyone calmed down. Life seemed ready to move on. Then we discovered something that made the entire situation much more serious. Later that morning, we were heading out to Tesco. As my parents prepared to leave, I turned back toward the front door. That's when I noticed something unusual. Around the area near the hinges were multiple scratches and deep indentations. At first I thought they were old marks. Then I looked closer. They were fresh. I immediately called my parents over. Together we examined the door. The marks weren't random. They looked exactly like damage caused by someone trying to force the door open. The scratches were concentrated around the hinges and frame. It looked as though a tool had been inserted there repeatedly, most likely a crowbar or something similar. The realization hit us immediately. The person outside hadn't simply been knocking. He had come back during the night and attempted to break into our house. Thankfully, the damage wasn't severe enough to require repairs. The door had held. The locks had done their job. Whoever had been trying to force entry eventually gave up. But that discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the teenager's strange request from earlier made much more sense. It may never have been about charging a phone at all. It could have been an excuse to see who was home, to see whether someone would open the door, to see whether my mom was alone. The more I think about it now, the more disturbing it becomes. If my mom had opened that door, anything could have happened. She was home alone with a child. The teenager may have assumed she would be easy to overpower. Or perhaps he wasn't planning to act alone. That's the thought that scares me the most. Remember that hidden area behind our garage? The place that couldn't easily be seen from the house? Someone could have been waiting there the entire time. The boy wasn't particularly large or intimidating. He may have simply been the person sent to knock, the person sent to convince someone to open the door. If the door had opened, maybe others would have emerged from the darkness. Maybe they were waiting in the field. Maybe they were hiding behind the garage. Maybe they were never there at all. We'll never know. What I do know is this. At 2 o'clock in the morning, someone was trying to force their way into our home. And if they had succeeded, they would have found me standing halfway down the staircase, directly in front of them. Even now, Years later, that realization still sends chills down my spine. Thankfully, my mom trusted her instincts. She recognized that something felt wrong because she refused to open the door, checked every lock, and secured the house. Whatever that person had planned never had the chance to happen. And for that, I will always be grateful. My family has experienced a lot of strange and genuinely terrifying things over the years. Some of the stories are small and easy to brush off, while others are so unsettling that even now nobody in the family likes talking about them for too long. But one story in particular has stayed in my mind ever since it happened, because of how disturbing and unexplainable it was. It happened to my Aunt Kim, not her real name, and to this day she refuses to sleep alone in that house for long periods of time. To understand why the experience shook everyone so badly, there's a little background that matters first. My aunt has always believed she was cursed or hexed somehow. I know that sounds dramatic, but strange things have followed her for most of her life. According to family stories, she's experienced unsettling events since she was young. Sleep paralysis, hearing voices, objects moving, nightmares that later matched real events, things like that. Some relatives believe she's just extremely sensitive or superstitious, while others genuinely think something darker follows her. Whether people believed her or not, everyone agreed on one thing: weird things always seemed to happen around her. At the time this particular incident happened, Aunt Kim was living alone with her youngest daughter Lily, also not her real name. Lily was still pretty young back then, and the two of them lived in a small, older house that always felt slightly eerie even during daytime. The house itself had a strange layout. My aunt's bedroom sat at the very end of a narrow hallway, while the kitchen connected directly to the living room. At night, the house became incredibly dark because very little outside light reached the windows. Once all the lights were off, the hallway especially looked almost pitch black. One night, sometime very late, Aunt Kim woke up feeling thirsty and decided to get a glass of water from the kitchen. At first, everything felt completely normal. The house was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds: faint creaking from old wood settling, the hum of appliances somewhere in the background, and distant wind outside. Lily was asleep in her room, and the rest of the neighborhood seemed completely silent. My aunt slowly walked down the hallway half asleep, still trying to wake herself up properly. She made it about halfway through the living room before something made her stop. She looked up toward the kitchen doorway, and that's when she saw her. Standing in the doorway was a woman. At least it looked like a woman. According to my aunt, the figure was pale beyond normal human skin tone, almost gray-white like something dead. She wore an old-fashioned blue dress that hung unnaturally still around her body. But the most horrifying part was her face. It looked distorted, not injured exactly. Wrong, like someone had taken a normal face and twisted parts of it out of place. The eyes looked uneven, the mouth stretched strangely, and the entire expression felt unnatural in a way my aunt still struggles to describe properly. The figure stood completely motionless, except for one thing. She was pointing directly at my aunt. That detail terrified her more than anything else. Not waving, not reaching, pointing like she wanted her attention specifically. My aunt said the second she locked eyes with the figure, overwhelming fear crashed into her so hard she couldn't even scream. Every instinct inside her body told her something was deeply wrong. Then, everything went black. That's the last thing she remembered inside the house. The next thing she knew, she was sitting in her car. At first, she didn't even understand where she was. She described it as suddenly coming back into herself, like waking from a dream or snapping out of a trance. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and the car engine was still running. When she finally looked around properly, sheer panic hit her. The car was parked directly on train tracks, completely alone in the darkness. She immediately looked at the clock. 3 a.m. To this day, she has absolutely no memory of leaving the house, grabbing her keys, getting into the car, or driving there. The entire period after seeing the woman in blue is simply gone from her memory. And the horrifying realization came next. Lily wasn't with her. My aunt completely broke down. Crying hysterically, she grabbed her phone and called one of her closest friends. Her friend managed to calm her down enough to figure out where she was and convince her to move the car off the tracks immediately. Then her friend asked the question that made everything worse. Where's Lily? The second my aunt realized her daughter was still alone back at the house, panic completely consumed her again. She drove home as fast as she could while crying the entire way, terrified something had happened while she was gone. When she arrived back at the house, she noticed the front door was wide open. That detail alone still gives me chills. She had apparently left in such a dazed state that she never even closed it behind her. She rushed inside expecting the worst. Instead, she found Lily sitting awake on the couch in the living room. According to Lily, she had woken up during the night and seen her mother leaving the house. Confused, she repeatedly tried talking to her and getting her attention, but Aunt Kim completely ignored her. Lily later said it was like her mother couldn't even hear her speaking. She just walked silently out the front door and left. That detail disturbed the family deeply because it didn't sound like normal sleepwalking or confusion. According to Lily, her mother moved strangely calm and emotionless, almost like she was in a trance. My aunt grabbed Lily immediately, packed some essentials, and left the house before sunrise. The two of them stayed at another aunt's house for the rest of the week because my aunt was too terrified to return alone afterward. To this day, nobody in the family fully knows what happened that night. Some relatives believe my aunt may have experienced some kind of dissociative episode or extreme sleepwalking event triggered by stress and fear. Others believe the figure she saw somehow caused it. But what still unsettles everyone is the timing and details. The woman in blue. The blackout. Waking up alone on train tracks at exactly 3:00 in the morning. And Lily watching her own mother silently leave the house without responding to her at all. My aunt still refuses to talk about the distorted face in too much detail because she says remembering it too clearly makes her physically sick. Even years later, she insists the fear she felt looking at that figure was unlike anything she had ever experienced before or since. Not ordinary fear. Something deeper. Primal, like every instinct inside her recognized danger before her mind could even process what she was seeing. The strangest part is that after that night, activity in the house supposedly became quieter for a while. No strange experiences. No nightmares. Almost like whatever happened had accomplished something, and then disappeared again. But every once in a while, Aunt Kim still wakes up in the middle of the night, convinced she sees a pale figure standing near doorways, watching her silently from the dark. And according to her, sometimes she still dreams about train tracks. I hate talking about this story, even now. Every time I think about it, the memories come flooding back, and I can still feel the same fear I felt that night. A lot of people probably won't believe what happened. And honestly, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. This happened a few years ago when I was a sophomore in high school. In the town where I grew up, there was an old place that almost everyone knew about. Locals called it Bradley Devil's Farm. It sat far away from the main roads, hidden behind overgrown trees and fields that had long since been abandoned. Most people avoided the place completely, especially after dark. The farm had a dark reputation that stretched back for decades. According to local legends, a judge had once lived there with his family. On the surface, he appeared to be a respected member of the community, but rumors claimed he lived a secret life. People said he practiced Satanism and performed strange rituals inside the house. For years, the stories circulated throughout town, passed down from one generation to the next. The most disturbing part of the legend involved the judge's family. According to the story, one of his rituals failed, and he became completely unhinged. Something inside him snapped. In a fit of rage, he allegedly murdered his entire family inside the farmhouse. After that, the property was abandoned, and strange stories began to surround the place. Some people claimed to hear voices coming from the empty house. Others reported seeing lights inside the windows despite there being no electricity. Whether those stories were true or not, they were enough to keep most people away. Of course, when you're a teenager, warnings like that only make a place more interesting. One weekend, a group of friends and I decided to visit the farm ourselves. We wanted to see if the stories were true, or if it was just another abandoned building with an exaggerated reputation. At first, I wasn't nervous. I'd explored abandoned places before. Old schools, empty warehouses, forgotten houses. I had seen plenty of creepy locations. Usually, once you got inside, you realized the place wasn't nearly as scary as people claimed. This place was different. The moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The sun had already started to set, and long shadows stretched across the property. The farmhouse stood in the distance, dark and silent. Even from far away, it looked unsettling. The windows resembled empty eyes staring out across the field. The structure seemed to blend into the darkness around it, almost as if it didn't belong there. As we walked toward the house, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sensation that someone was watching us. At first, I ignored it. I figured my imagination was getting the better of me because of all the stories I had heard. But with every step we took, the feeling became stronger. The closer we got to the farmhouse, the more uncomfortable I became. I wasn't the only one either. The usual jokes and laughter that had filled the walk began to disappear. One by one, everyone grew quieter. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared, but I could tell from their faces that they felt it too. When we finally reached the front of the house, we paused for a moment before going inside. The air felt strangely heavy. The silence around us was unnatural. No birds. No insects. Nothing. Just silence. We stepped through the front entrance and began exploring. The inside looked exactly how you'd expect an abandoned farmhouse to look. Dust covered every surface. Furniture lay broken and scattered throughout the rooms. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, and parts of the ceiling had collapsed over the years. Yet despite all of that, it felt as though we weren't alone. I kept finding myself glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should have been. Every hallway looked longer than normal. At one point, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. We continued moving through the house room by room. Then, someone noticed something. One of our friends was missing. At first, we assumed he had wandered off into another part of the house. We called his name and waited for a response. Nothing, we called again. Still nothing. Suddenly, panic started spreading through the group. The farmhouse wasn't huge, but it was large enough that someone could disappear from sight if they walked off alone. We split up and began searching. We checked every room we had already explored. No sign of him. We searched the hallways. Nothing. The deeper we searched, the more anxious we became. Then we heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A faint tapping sound echoed through the house. Everyone froze. The noise was distant at first, but it was clearly coming from somewhere upstairs. For a moment, nobody moved. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. Against our better judgment, we followed the sound. As we climbed the stairs, the tapping became louder. Tap, tap, tap. Each step seemed to bring us closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Nobody was speaking anymore. The only sounds were our footsteps and the steady tapping echoing through the old house. Eventually, the noise led us to the master bedroom. The door stood slightly open. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence felt even worse. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, one of us slowly pushed the door open. What I saw inside is something I will never forget. To this day, it remains the most horrifying thing I have ever witnessed. Our missing friend was lying on the bed. At first, I felt relief because we had finally found him. Then I saw that he wasn't alone. Sitting on top of him was a woman. She looked to be somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. She held a knife in one hand. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Everything felt frozen. Then she slowly turned her head toward us. The moment I saw her face, every ounce of relief vanished. Her appearance was beyond anything I can properly describe. Her eyes were gone. Not closed. Gone. Dark, empty sockets stared back at us from where her eyes should have been. Her mouth had been sliced from ear to ear into a grotesque grin. The wound stretched unnaturally across her face, exposing teeth beneath torn flesh. It looked impossible. Wrong, like something no human being should ever look like. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. We were too shocked to react. Then she smiled. That horrific smile somehow widened even further. What happened next still gives me nightmares. She raised the knife. Without hesitation, she pressed the blade against our friend's face. Then, she slowly began cutting. The knife carved across his cheeks, creating the same twisted grin she carried herself. Our friend's screams filled the room. Several people in our group began shouting. Everything descended into chaos. One of my friends suddenly rushed into the room, attempting to pull our injured friend away from her. The instant he crossed the doorway, the bedroom door slammed shut with incredible force. The sound echoed through the entire house. We threw ourselves against the door immediately. It wouldn't move. It felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut. We kicked. We shoved. We screamed. But the door refused to open. Minutes felt like hours. The sounds coming from inside eventually stopped, making the situation even more terrifying. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the door suddenly gave way. We stumbled into the room. The woman was gone, completely gone. There was nowhere she could have escaped. No open windows, no hidden exits, nothing, yet she had vanished. Our friend was still lying on the bed. He was alive, but barely conscious. Blood covered his face. The cuts stretched across his cheeks in the exact same horrifying smile that the woman had carried. We immediately called for help. Emergency responders arrived and rushed him to the hospital. The injuries were severe. Doctors worked for hours trying to repair the damage. Eventually, he slipped into a coma. The entire incident left him permanently scarred. In the days that followed, investigators searched the farmhouse, but they never found any trace of the woman. No footprints. No fingerprints. No evidence that anyone else had been inside the house. As strange as that was, the most disturbing discovery came later. While researching the property's history, we learned something that made the entire experience even more unsettling. The woman we had seen wasn't believed to be the judge's wife. According to local stories, she was the housemaid. Years before the murders, she had reportedly been involved in a secret affair with the judge. Their relationship was hidden from everyone in town. When rumors began threatening to expose him, the judge allegedly killed her to ensure she would never reveal the truth. Her body was supposedly buried somewhere on the property. Many people believed her spirit never left. Some claimed she wandered the farmhouse searching for revenge. Others believed she was trapped there, forever reliving the betrayal that led to her death. Before that night, I would have dismissed those stories as nothing more than local legends. Now I'm not so sure. I know what I saw. I know what my friends saw. And I know that one of them carries the scars from that night to this day. I've visited abandoned buildings since then, but none of them have ever felt like Bradley Devil's Farm. There was something about that place that felt wrong from the moment we arrived. Something that watched us from the shadows. Something that didn't want us there. And sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about that woman's face. The empty eye sockets. The impossible grin. The knife reflecting the faint light from the window. No matter how much time passes, those images never seem to fade. Part of me wishes I had never stepped foot on that property. Another part of me is simply grateful that I made it out alive. I have a terrifying memory from my childhood, and even after all these years, I can still remember every detail as clearly as if it happened yesterday. At the time, I was 11 years old. It was the middle of summer, and the night had been completely normal. I had gone to bed like any other night, expecting nothing unusual to happen. Looking back now, what makes the experience even stranger is how random everything felt. There was no reason for me to wake up, yet for some reason, I suddenly opened my eyes in the middle of the night. When I looked at the clock, it was exactly 3 in the morning. I remember feeling thirsty, so I got out of bed and quietly walked down the hallway to the bathroom. The house was completely silent. Everyone else was asleep, and the darkness made everything feel strangely empty. At the time, I wasn't scared. I was just focused on filling up my water bottle and getting back to bed. I turned on the faucet, filled my bottle, took a small drink, and headed back to my room. Nothing seemed unusual. Everything felt calm and ordinary. Once I got back to my bedroom, I climbed into bed and took another drink of water. I set the bottle beside me, pulled the blanket up, and closed my eyes. I was already starting to drift back to sleep when something happened that I have never been able to explain. Out of nowhere, a sound erupted from outside. To this day, I struggle to describe exactly what it sounded like. The closest comparison I can make is that it sounded like a mix between a battle cry and a giant horn blast. It wasn't a normal noise. It wasn't something I had ever heard before. And it wasn't something I've heard since. The sound seemed powerful, almost unnatural. It echoed through the night with an intensity that immediately sent a shock through my entire body. The moment I heard it, every trace of sleep vanished. I sat upright in bed, completely frozen. For a few seconds, I just listened, hoping I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The sound had been real. It had been loud enough that there was no way it was just part of a dream. Panic quickly took over. I jumped out of bed and ran down the hallway to my mother's room. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my chest. I expected her to be asleep, but when I entered the room, I immediately realized something was wrong. She was already awake. The look on her face told me everything. She had heard it too. I remember feeling both relieved and terrified at the same time. Relieved because I wasn't imagining things, but terrified because if she had heard it as well, then whatever made that sound had actually happened. We sat there trying to make sense of what we had heard. The strangest part was that both of us had woken up only minutes before the sound occurred. Neither of us had any reason to be awake. We had both been sleeping normally, yet somehow we had both awakened shortly before whatever happened outside. My mother tried to come up with explanations. At one point, she suggested that it might have been an air horn or some kind of vehicle noise in the distance. But I knew what an air horn sounded like. This wasn't an air horn. The sound was deeper, stranger, and far more unsettling than anything I had ever heard before. It carried a feeling with it that is difficult to put into words. It wasn't just the noise itself that frightened me. It was the way it made me feel. It felt wrong. That's the best way I can describe it. Eventually, my mother tried to calm me down and encouraged me to go back to bed. I returned to my room, but by then, sleep was completely out of the question. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt something I had never experienced before. It was the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. The room was exactly the same as it had always been. Nothing had changed. Yet everything felt different. Every shadow seemed darker. Every corner seemed deeper. The silence that normally felt peaceful now felt oppressive. I climbed back into bed and stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I kept telling myself that I was safe. I kept reminding myself that my family was nearby. But the feeling refused to go away. Minutes felt like hours. Every little creak in the house made me jump. Every movement of the curtains made my stomach tighten. I found myself constantly looking around the room. Several times throughout the night, I could have sworn that I saw figures standing in the shadows. Whenever I turned my head quickly, I thought I caught glimpses of dark shapes lurking just beyond my field of vision. They looked almost human, but not entirely. Their forms were vague and shadowy, disappearing the moment I focused on them directly. I know how that sounds. Even now, part of me wonders whether fear was playing tricks on my mind. But at the time, those figures felt completely real. Each time I thought I saw one, a surge of terror shot through me. I would blink, look again, and find nothing there. Then a few minutes later, the feeling would return. The entire night became a battle between logic and fear. Part of me tried to explain everything away. I told myself that I was tired. I told myself that the darkness was making ordinary objects look strange. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened when that sound echoed through the night. Something about it felt different from any normal experience. I stayed awake for hours. The darkness seemed endless. At some point, I stopped even trying to sleep. Instead, I sat there watching the room, waiting for the first signs of daylight. It felt like the night would never end. Then finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the darkness outside began to fade. The first light of dawn slowly crept through the windows. As the room brightened, the fear that had gripped me all night began to loosen its hold. The shadows retreated. The corners of the room no longer seemed threatening. Everything started to look normal again. By the time morning arrived, I was completely exhausted. I hadn't slept at all, not even for a few minutes. I remember sitting there feeling drained, confused, and emotionally worn out from spending an entire night in a state of fear. Later that morning, my siblings came into my room. The moment they saw me, they immediately noticed something was wrong. I probably looked terrible. My eyes were heavy, my face was pale, and I looked like someone who had just gone through a major crisis. They asked what happened. So I told them everything. I explained how I had woken up at 3 in the morning. I told them about filling my water bottle, hearing the strange sound outside, running to our mother's room, and spending the entire night convinced that something was watching me. I expected them to take me seriously. Instead, they laughed. They told me I was being crazy. They said I must have imagined the whole thing. Some even suggested that I had been hallucinating because I was tired. Their reactions frustrated me because they hadn't heard what I heard. More importantly, they couldn't explain why my mother had heard it too. That detail has always stuck with me. If I had been the only one awake, I might have eventually convinced myself that it was all in my head. But I wasn't alone. My mother heard the sound as well. That's why I've never been able to completely dismiss the experience. As time passed, life moved on. The years went by, and I stopped talking about that night. Whenever I thought about bringing it up again, I always talked myself out of it. Part of me worried that people would react the same way my siblings did. Another part of me wondered whether my mother would even remember it. Sometimes I think about asking her. I imagine walking up to her and saying, "Do you remember that strange sound we heard in the middle of the night when I was 11? But then I hesitate. I worry that she'll simply shrug it off and tell me it was a dream or some ordinary noise that we've both exaggerated over the years. Maybe she's right. Maybe there is a simple explanation. But even now, something about that night doesn't sit right with me. The memory has never faded. I can still remember the exact feeling that settled over me after hearing that sound. I can still remember the fear, the confusion, and the certainty that something strange had happened. I've spent years wondering what it could have been. Was it some unusual animal call? A distant mechanical noise distorted by the night air? A sound carried from miles away under the perfect atmospheric conditions? Or was it something else entirely? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that it remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Even after all this time, I can still picture that dark bedroom, hear that impossible sound echoing through the night, and feel the overwhelming sensation that something unseen was watching from somewhere just beyond the darkness. Maybe there is a logical explanation that I simply haven't found yet. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that the experience felt real, and the memory has stayed with me ever since. I've never forgotten that night, and I don't think I ever will. There are two experiences from my childhood that still bother me to this day. Even though years have passed, I can remember both of them with surprising clarity. I've tried to explain them away countless times. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe fear distorted my memory. But no matter how many logical explanations I come up with, neither experience has ever fully left me. The first happened when I was around 6 or 7 years old. My older sister had what I considered the coolest bedroom in the entire house. The main reason was her bunk bed. To a little kid, having a bunk bed seemed like the greatest thing imaginable. Since I was the younger sister, I constantly begged her to let me sleep in her room. Thankfully, she was usually pretty nice about it. Once or twice a week, she'd let me climb up to the top bunk and have a little sleepover with her. Our parents always expected us to go straight to sleep, but we never did. We'd spend a few minutes whispering, giggling, and shushing each other before finally settling down for the night. One evening seemed completely normal at first. We had gone through our usual routine and eventually turned off the lights. My sister fell asleep quickly, but for some reason, I couldn't. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours. Then something strange happened. Out of nowhere, a feeling of panic settled over me. There wasn't a sound. There wasn't a shadow. There wasn't anything I could point to and say was wrong. Yet every instinct in my body was telling me that something wasn't right. The feeling grew stronger with every passing minute. My chest felt tight. My stomach twisted into knots. I suddenly felt terrified without understanding why. Being so young, I didn't know how to process the feeling. I started quietly crying into my pillow, trying not to wake my sister. I looked around the room, expecting to find something frightening lurking in the darkness. Nothing. Everything appeared completely normal. The dresser was where it always was. The desk sat quietly in the corner. The bedroom door was closed. Nothing seemed out of place. Eventually, I rolled onto my side and stared at the wall. My mom loved decorating our rooms with family photographs. She especially liked hanging our yearly school and sports pictures. The walls were covered with snapshots from different stages of our childhood. As I scanned the photos, my eyes landed on one of my sister. It was one of her basketball pictures. She was standing there in her uniform, holding a basketball and smiling for the camera. I had seen the picture hundreds of times, but that night, something looked different. Her smile seemed strange. It looked forced, almost unnatural. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. I stared at the picture longer. The longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Something about her expression felt wrong. Then my eyes drifted downward toward the basketball she was holding. That's when it happened. The basketball moved. It started spinning in her hands. For a second, my brain completely froze. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. I blinked several times. The ball stopped. Everything looked normal again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Slowly, I looked back toward her face. What I saw next terrified me. Her eyes were wide open, far wider than they should have been. And that smile, that same unnatural smile, had stretched even wider across her face. Then she winked at me. I felt every ounce of blood drain from my body. The panic that had been building inside me exploded. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared. Then, survival instinct took over. Without hesitation, I threw the blanket over my head. Every child knows the universal rule: nothing scary can get you if you're completely covered by blankets. At least that's what I desperately wanted to believe. I stayed hidden underneath the covers for several minutes. My heart refused to slow down. Eventually, curiosity started fighting with fear. I slowly pulled the blanket down just enough to peek out. This time, I refused to look directly at that picture. Instead, I examined the other photographs hanging around the room. Everything looked normal. Every picture was completely still. Nothing unusual. Nothing moving. Gradually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Then I made the mistake of looking back toward the basketball picture. The moment my eyes landed on it, the basketball spun again. Not a tiny movement. Not a trick of the light. It spun. I immediately pulled the blanket back over my head. I didn't look again for the rest of the night. At some point, exhaustion finally won. I cried myself to sleep underneath those blankets. The next morning, everything looked completely normal. The picture was exactly how it had always been. No strange smile, no wide eyes, no spinning basketball. For years, I tried convincing myself that I had simply been tired or scared. Maybe my imagination got carried away. Maybe shadows played tricks on me. Maybe. But even now, more than a decade later, I still remember exactly what I saw. And every time I think about it, the same uncomfortable feeling returns. The second experience happened years later when I was around 12. Unlike the first experience, I was older, more rational, and far less likely to scare myself. That's one reason why this event bothers me so much. My entire family had gone to see a movie together. It wasn't just my immediate family either. My grandparents came. My uncles and aunts came. My cousins came. It was one of those big family outings where half the theater seemed to be filled with relatives. The movie itself wasn't important. Nothing unusual happened during it. The strange part began afterward. When the movie ended, everyone gathered in the lobby to say goodbye before heading home. At some point, I told everyone I was going to use the restroom before we left. No one thought anything of it. I walked into the women's restroom alone. As far as I could tell, nobody else was inside. The room was completely silent. I entered a stall and went about my business. Everything was normal. Then I heard it. A voice. A loud, deep, masculine voice. The moment it spoke, every muscle in my body locked up. The voice wasn't calling out casually. It wasn't asking a question. It wasn't trying to get someone's attention. It was shouting. And it shouted my full first name. Not my nickname, not a shortened version. My full first name. The sound echoed through the restroom. The voice was so sudden and so aggressive that my heart practically jumped into my throat. I froze instantly. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just sat there staring at the stall door. The voice didn't speak again. The silence returned immediately. I listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. No doors opening. Nothing at that point. Fear completely took over. I didn't even bother flushing. I jumped up, pulled my pants up, unlocked the stall, and practically ran out of the restroom. I expected to find someone standing outside. Maybe a family member playing a prank. Maybe someone looking for me. Maybe someone who somehow knew me. Instead, the hallway was empty. I hurried into the lobby. Nobody was there. My entire family had already finished saying their goodbyes. The lobby was mostly empty except for a few strangers. None of them looked familiar. None of them appeared to know me. My panic only grew worse. I rushed outside and found my dad waiting in the car near the curb. The moment I got inside, he looked at me and immediately knew something was wrong. Apparently, I looked terrified. He asked what happened. I hesitated before asking him a question. I wanted to know if he had been messing with me. Had he come near the restroom and shouted my name? Was he trying to hurry me up? Was it some kind of joke? He looked genuinely confused. Then he shook his head. He told me he hadn't gone anywhere near the restroom. According to him, everyone else had already left, and he had been the last person to head outside and move the car to the pickup area. There was no opportunity for him to do what I described. He even offered to go back inside and check the building if it would make me feel better. But I didn't want to go back inside, not even for a second. I just wanted to go home. The ride back was quiet. I spent most of it staring out the window, replaying the voice in my head. To this day, I can still hear it. The tone, the volume, the anger. Most of all, I remember the feeling it caused. It wasn't just surprise. It felt personal, as if whatever had called my name specifically wanted my attention. Years have passed since then. I've grown older. I've experienced far scarier situations than a strange voice in a restroom or a moving photograph in a dark bedroom. Yet somehow, these two moments remain among the most unsettling memories of my life. I still don't know what I saw in that photograph. I still don't know who or what called my name that day at the movie theater. Maybe both experiences have perfectly reasonable explanations. Maybe they don't. All I know is that even now, many years later, whenever I hear a deep male voice say my full first name instead of my usual nickname, my heart still skips a beat. And whenever I walk past old family photographs late at night, part of me still avoids looking too closely at the faces, just in case one of them decides to look back. One of the scariest stories in my family happened before I was even old enough to remember it for myself. I've heard the story many times from my parents over the years, and every time they tell it, it sends chills down my spine. At the time, I was only 3 years old. My dad was what most people would call a jack of all trades. His work took our family all over the country, so moving from one place to another was just a normal part of life. During this particular period, we were living in New Mexico. One afternoon, my mom decided to take me with her to do some grocery shopping. It was supposed to be a completely ordinary trip. Nothing about the day seemed unusual when we left the house. We were simply running errands like any other family. As they walked through the store, my mom began working her way down the aisles, picking up the items she needed while keeping an eye on me. At first, everything seemed normal. Then she noticed 3 men. They weren't doing anything openly threatening. They weren't talking to her or trying to get her attention, but something about them immediately made her uncomfortable. The men appeared to be moving through the store at roughly the same pace as my mom. Every time she entered a different aisle, they seemed to appear nearby. At first, she assumed it was a coincidence. But after several minutes, she began noticing something else. They kept looking at us, not the casual glance people give strangers in public places. They were watching us. Every time she looked in their direction, one or more of them seemed to be staring. The feeling in her stomach grew worse. My mom has always described it as a gut instinct. She couldn't explain it logically. Nothing had happened yet. There was no obvious danger, but every part of her was telling her that something wasn't right. The longer she stayed in the store, the stronger that feeling became. Instead of continuing to browse, she decided to finish shopping as quickly as possible. She grabbed the last few items on her list and headed straight for the checkout lanes. Even while waiting to pay, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As soon as she finished checking out, she gathered the groceries and headed toward the exit. That's when things became even more unsettling. Through the front windows of the store, she saw the same 3 men standing outside. They weren't heading to their car. They weren't talking among themselves. They were standing near the entrance, looking through the windows, watching us. At that moment, every alarm bell in her head went off. Whatever uncertainty she had felt before disappeared. She knew she needed to leave immediately. Without wasting a second, she grabbed the grocery bags with one hand and scooped me up with the other. Then, she ran. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the parking lot as fast as she could. As she later described it, pure adrenaline took over. Her only thought was getting to the car before those men reached her. The parking lot suddenly felt enormous. Every step seemed to take forever. She could feel her heart pounding as she rushed toward the vehicle. When she reached it, she yanked open the door, tossed the groceries inside, placed me in the back seat, jumped behind the wheel, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she noticed the men beginning to move toward where her car had been parked. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She drove away as quickly as she could. By the time she got home, she was still shaken. When my dad returned from work later that day, she told him everything. She explained how strange the men had acted, how they seemed to follow her through the store, and how she felt they had been watching us the entire time. My dad listened carefully, but at the time there wasn't much either of them could do. The men hadn't directly approached her, and nothing had actually happened. Still, the feeling stayed with her. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Then the situation took a horrifying turn. Later that day, a 19-year-old employee who worked at the same grocery store disappeared after finishing her shift. When she failed to return home, concern quickly turned into a missing persons investigation. Days passed without answers. Then, about a week later, the story appeared on the local evening news. As my parents watched the broadcast, they were stunned. The report showed photographs of 3 suspects connected to the investigation. They were the same 3 men my mother had seen in the grocery store. The exact same men. The realization left both of my parents speechless. The men were eventually arrested and connected to the disappearance of the young employee. The details of the crime were horrific and deeply disturbing, confirming that they were extremely dangerous individuals. My parents sat there in shock as they realized how close my mother and I had come to crossing paths with them under different circumstances. For my mom, the realization was overwhelming. The uneasy feeling she had experienced in the store suddenly made perfect sense. That instinct that told her to leave, that voice in the back of her mind warning her that something wasn't right. It may have saved both of us. Even now, years later, my mother still struggles with guilt when she talks about that day. She often wonders if she should have reported the men to someone at the store or mentioned their behavior to management. She questions whether doing so might have changed what happened later. My dad always reminds her that she couldn't have known what those men were capable of. At the time, all she had was a feeling. She had no evidence, no proof, and no way of knowing what would happen afterward. Still, it's something she has carried with her ever since. The experience changed both of my parents. After that day, my father became much more protective whenever it came to shopping trips and public outings. He rarely wanted my mom going alone with me, especially when I was young. The incident also became a powerful lesson that stayed with our family. People often talk about trusting your instincts, but this story is the reason my parents firmly believe in it. Sometimes there isn't a logical explanation. Sometimes you can't point to a specific action or threat. Sometimes all you have is a feeling deep inside that tells you something is wrong. On that afternoon in New Mexico, my mother listened to that feeling. And when she did, she picked up her child, ran for the car, and got out of there as fast as she could. Looking back now, neither of my parents likes to think about what might have happened if she had ignored it. What began as an ordinary trip to the grocery store became one of the most frightening close calls our family has ever experienced. And even though I was too young to remember it myself, it's a story that has stayed with all of us ever since. One of the strangest periods of my life began when my family moved into a new apartment. At first, it seemed like a fresh start. The apartment looked nice, the neighborhood was quiet, and everyone was excited about settling into a new place. Because both of my parents worked full-time jobs, I spent a lot of time at home by myself. At first, I enjoyed the independence. I could do my homework, watch television, and relax until my parents came home from work. Everything seemed normal during our first couple of days there. Then something happened. It was only 2 days after we moved in. I was sitting alone at the dining table, passing the time as usual. The apartment was completely quiet. There were no televisions on, no music playing, and no one else in the house. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from my bedroom. The noise startled me. At first, I assumed something had simply fallen over. Curious, I got up from the dining table and walked toward my room to see what had happened. When I entered, I found my school bag lying on the floor. It wasn't particularly strange. Maybe I hadn't placed it properly. Maybe it had been balanced on the edge of something and slipped off. Without thinking much about it, I picked it up and placed it back on my bed. This time, however, I made sure it was secure. I positioned it near the center of the mattress where there was no possible way it could accidentally slide off. Satisfied that it wouldn't fall again, I left the room and returned to the dining area. About 30 minutes later, while I was sitting there, another loud thud shattered the silence. The sound came from exactly the same place. My bedroom. Immediately, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Slowly, I got up and walked back to the room. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I froze. My bag was on the floor again. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. This time, I knew something wasn't right. I clearly remembered placing the bag in the middle of the bed. There was no slope. There was no edge nearby. Nothing could have caused it to slide off naturally. Yet somehow, it was lying on the floor exactly as if someone had picked it up and thrown it down. A chill ran through me. I tried convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I hadn't placed it as securely as I remembered. Maybe I was overthinking it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. From that day forward, I never felt completely comfortable in that apartment. A few weeks later, another strange incident occurred. I was returning home from one of my classes when I noticed something unusual outside our apartment building. Lying near the entrance was a half-cut coconut and a half-cut lemon. At first glance, it seemed like ordinary trash. But the closer I looked, the stranger it appeared. The coconut was dark black and looked rotten, as though it had been sitting there for a very long time. Something about it felt unsettling. I couldn't explain why. The sight of it left me with an uncomfortable feeling that lingered long after I went inside. As the months passed, the strange occurrences continued. At first, they were subtle. Small noises, unexplained sounds, things that could easily be dismissed. But eventually, the experiences became harder to ignore. Sometimes I would hear footsteps when no one else was home. Other times, strange sounds would come from empty rooms. Doors would creak open. Objects would seem to move slightly from where they had been left. Every incident on its own could probably be explained away. The problem was that they kept happening, and I wasn't the only one experiencing them. Eventually, my parents started noticing things too. One evening, my mother asked if I had called her from another room. I hadn't. Another time, my father thought he heard someone moving through the apartment after everyone had gone to bed. When he checked, nobody was there. The strangest experiences involved voices, not clear conversations, not words we could understand. Just faint sounds that seemed to come from somewhere inside the apartment. Sometimes it sounded like someone whispering. Sometimes it sounded like distant talking. Whenever we tried to locate the source, the sounds would stop. Then there were the shadows. More than once, members of my family thought they saw movement out of the corners of their eyes, dark shapes passing through hallways, brief silhouettes appearing near doorways. The moment we turned to look directly at them, they vanished. It became something we rarely discussed openly because none of us wanted to sound crazy. But we all knew we were experiencing strange things. The apartment slowly developed an atmosphere that was difficult to describe. Friends who visited occasionally commented that the place felt unusual. Some said it felt colder than expected. Others mentioned feeling uncomfortable despite not knowing anything about our experiences. The longer we lived there, the more uneasy we became. What made everything worse was that the activity seemed completely random. There was no pattern, no specific time, no clear explanation. Sometimes weeks would pass without anything happening. Then suddenly several strange incidents would occur within a few days. Living there felt like constantly waiting for something you couldn't explain. By the second year, none of us liked being alone in the apartment. Even during the daytime, there was always a lingering feeling that someone else was there. Watching, listening, waiting. Eventually, after more than 2 years of living with these experiences, my family decided to move. The decision wasn't based entirely on the strange events, but I think all of us were relieved to leave. The day we packed our belongings and walked out of that apartment for the final time felt like a weight had been lifted. I remember feeling lighter almost immediately, as though the tension that had surrounded us for years was finally gone. The most interesting part is what happened afterward. Nothing. The strange noises stopped. The voices disappeared. The shadows were gone. No more unexplained sounds. No more unsettling experiences. Life returned to normal. Looking back now, I still don't know what was happening in that apartment. Maybe there were logical explanations for everything. Maybe old buildings make strange noises. Maybe our minds connected unrelated events and turned them into something more frightening. Or maybe there was genuinely something unusual about that place. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that for more than 2 years, my family experienced things we couldn't explain. And the moment we left that apartment behind, every single one of those experiences came to an end. To this day, whenever I think about that apartment, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the rooms, the furniture, or the neighborhood. It's the sound of that bag hitting the floor for the second time, because that was the moment I first realized that something about that place didn't feel right. There is one experience from my past that still bothers me to this day. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation for it, but no matter how much I think about it, I always end up with more questions than answers. It all started in 2016. At the time, a few friends and I were obsessed with paranormal stories. We spent hours watching ghost videos, reading creepy accounts online, and discussing strange mysteries. Eventually, one of us suggested something that seemed exciting at the time. We should buy a Ouija board. At first, everyone thought it was a great idea. We talked about all the possibilities and joked about what questions we would ask. Looking back, most of us were probably more curious than serious. A few days later, we ordered one online. The excitement lasted right up until the board arrived. Once it was actually sitting in front of us, reality kicked in. Suddenly, nobody seemed quite as enthusiastic. The idea of using it felt very different from simply talking about it. One friend suggested we return it. Everyone quickly agreed. We hadn't even opened it yet, and already we were trying to get rid of it. My friend pulled up the seller's information so we could arrange a return. That's when things became strange. The seller's account was gone. Not inactive. Gone, the listing had disappeared. The account couldn't be found. Even the contact information seemed to have vanished. It was almost as if the seller had never existed. We searched for the account repeatedly, but found nothing. At the time, we joked that it felt like the seller had been erased from the internet. Eventually, we gave up trying to return it. The board was already there, and after spending so much time talking ourselves into it, curiosity won. We decided to play. It started exactly how you'd expect. We sat around the board and placed our fingers on the planchette. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then it moved. At first, I laughed. I was completely convinced one of my friends was pushing it. I remember looking around the room, expecting someone to crack a smile or admit they were messing with everyone. Nobody did. The planchette continued moving, slowly, deliberately, letter by letter. Eventually, it spelled out a sentence. None of us recognized it. The phrase sounded strange and almost meaningless. We asked a few more questions, but the responses weren't particularly interesting. Eventually, the session ended, and life moved on. For a while, I didn't think much about it. Then one day, out of curiosity, I searched the phrase online. The results immediately caught my attention. According to what I found, the sentence was associated with a cult. It wasn't a common quote. It wasn't a popular saying. It was something connected to a specific group. The discovery unsettled me, but I still assumed it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe one of my friends had seen it somewhere before without realizing it. Maybe somebody had secretly moved the planchette. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Over time, I forgot about the incident. Years passed. Then, something happened that brought the memory rushing back. Around 3 years later, a distant friend of mine passed away. He wasn't one of the friends who had participated in the Ouija board session. In fact, he had nothing to do with it. We weren't extremely close, but I knew him well enough that I wanted to pay my respects. A few days later, I visited his family's home. My friend had been a musician and songwriter. Music was his passion. One of the rooms in the house had a wall covered with lyrics and ideas he had written over the years. Most of the pages were simple white sheets of paper filled with handwritten notes. I spent some time looking through them. Then, something caught my eye. Right in the center of the wall was a single sheet of colored paper. Unlike the others, it immediately stood out. For reasons I can't explain, I found myself staring at it. Then, I read the words written on it. My stomach dropped. The phrase was identical, word for word. It was the exact same sentence that had been spelled out during the Ouija board session years earlier. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. I read it again, and again. There was no mistake. It was the same phrase. Out of hundreds of possible things he could have written, somehow that exact sentence was displayed in the center of the wall. The room suddenly felt much colder. Questions flooded my mind. How did he know that phrase? Had he encountered the same cult references I had found online? Was it simply a coincidence? Had he been interested in the subject for reasons I never knew about? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What disturbed me most was the timeline. My friend wasn't dead when the Ouija board session happened. He was alive and well 3 years earlier. That ruled out the explanation that somehow he had been communicating through the board. The dates simply didn't match. Yet the connection remained. A phrase from a strange Ouija board session appeared years later on the wall of someone who had never been involved in it. I've tried to explain it rationally. Maybe the phrase was more common than I realized. Maybe it appeared somewhere in music, literature, or online communities that both of us happened to encounter independently. Maybe there was a completely normal reason for it being on his wall. But even today, I can't shake the feeling that there's something important I never understood. The memory of standing in that room remains crystal clear. The colorful paper, the handwritten words, the sudden realization, the overwhelming feeling of dread. I remember looking around the room, wondering if anyone else knew the significance of what I was seeing. Of course, I never brought it up. It didn't seem like the appropriate time or place. Instead, I kept the thought to myself. Years have passed since then, but the mystery has never left me. I don't know what moved the planchette that night. I don't know why it spelled out that particular phrase, and I don't know why the exact same words later appeared among my friend's writings. Maybe it's all an incredible coincidence. Maybe there are pieces of the story I'm missing. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation that I simply haven't found yet. What I do know is that every time I think about that colored sheet of paper hanging in the center of that wall, I feel the same chill I felt when I first saw it. Because the real question was never whether my friend was communicating through the board. The real question is how two completely separate events, years apart, became connected by the exact same phrase, and after all this time, I still don't have an answer. A few years ago, I was promoted to manager at a well-known franchise store. I was only 25 at the time, and it felt like a huge step forward in my career. The store was constantly busy, and managing it meant dealing with every type of person imaginable. On any given day, we'd encounter angry customers, shoplifters, scammers, intoxicated people, and individuals who simply seemed to enjoy causing problems. After a while, you develop a sense for trouble. You learn how to read people, recognize suspicious behavior, and trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. Most of the time, those instincts were accurate. But there was one customer I encountered who stood out more than anyone else. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. In fact, he looked completely ordinary. He wasn't intimidating. He wasn't particularly memorable. If you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. He was the kind of person who blended into a crowd effortlessly. Yet from the very first moment I saw him, something about him felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. There was no specific action that triggered my concern. No obvious threat. No strange behavior. Just a feeling. An uncomfortable feeling that settled in the back of my mind whenever he entered the store. At first, I dismissed it. After all, I interacted with hundreds of customers every week. It would have been ridiculous to assume someone was dangerous simply because they gave me a bad feeling, but the feeling never went away. Every time he came into the store, I found myself watching him. Not because I intended to, because I couldn't help it. Something about him kept drawing my attention. One afternoon, I finally noticed what was bothering me. His focus wasn't on the merchandise. It wasn't on shopping. It wasn't even on the store itself. His attention was fixed on one of our female employees. At first, I thought it might be harmless. Maybe he found her attractive. Maybe he was simply watching her by coincidence. But the longer I observed him, the more uncomfortable I became. He wasn't casually looking at her. He was studying her, watching her movements, tracking where she went, waiting. The sight immediately reminded me of a conversation I'd had with that same employee just a few days earlier. She had come to me after one of her shifts, looking visibly nervous. She explained that for several nights in a row, a strange vehicle had been following her after work. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Then, it kept happening. The same vehicle, the same route, always appearing behind her when she left. She couldn't identify the driver, but she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. At the time, I told her to be careful and to let me know if it happened again. But now, standing in the store and watching this customer stare at her, a connection formed in my mind. I couldn't prove anything. I had no evidence. But my instincts were screaming. I decided to pay closer attention. Over the next several days, I watched him whenever he came into the store. The pattern continued. He always seemed interested in where she was. When she moved to another section, his eyes followed. When she disappeared into the stockroom, he lingered nearby. The behavior was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. But once I saw it, I couldn't ignore it. Eventually, I made a decision. The next time she worked an evening shift, I stayed later than usual. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I simply waited. The store eventually closed, and employees began heading home one by one. As expected, she finished her shift and left. A few minutes later, I noticed a familiar vehicle pull out of the parking lot. The same customer, the same man who had been watching her. My stomach tightened. I got into my own car and followed at a distance. At first, nothing happened. The employee drove normally. The customer followed. So did I. Several minutes passed. Then I noticed him getting closer. The gap between their vehicles began shrinking. He wasn't just traveling in the same direction anymore. He was actively following her. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through me. Every warning bell in my head was going off. I watched as he continued closing the distance. At that moment, I stopped questioning myself. Whatever this man's intentions were, they weren't good. I accelerated and moved ahead of him. My heart was pounding. Part of me knew this was a terrible idea. The other part didn't care. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did nothing, something bad was going to happen. When I found an opportunity, I pulled in front of his vehicle and forced him to stop. Everything happened quickly after that. I got out of my car and confronted him. The confidence he'd carried inside the store was gone. For the first time, he looked nervous. I made it very clear that I knew what he was doing. I told him that I had seen him watching my employee. I told him I had seen him following her. And I warned him that if he ever came near her again, there would be consequences. Throughout the confrontation, he barely spoke. He didn't argue. He didn't deny anything. He simply nodded. His hands were shaking. His face had gone pale. The entire time, he looked like someone who had been caught doing something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. Eventually, he got back into his vehicle and drove away. I stood there for several moments, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness. Afterward, I called the employee and made sure she got home safely. She did. The following days passed without incident. The customer never returned to the store. The strange vehicle stopped appearing behind her. Gradually, life returned to normal. I assumed the situation was over. Then, about a week later, I was at home watching the evening news. A breaking story interrupted the broadcast. Police had arrested a man in connection with multiple violent crimes. His photograph appeared on the screen. The moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. It was him. The same man. The customer from my store. The man I had confronted. As the report continued, the details became increasingly horrifying. Investigators linked him to a series of attacks involving multiple women. Authorities alleged that several victims had been assaulted over a period of years. Even worse, he was also suspected in the deaths of 2 women. I sat frozen in front of the television. For several minutes, I couldn't process what I was hearing. The ordinary-looking customer who had triggered my instincts wasn't just a creep. He was allegedly a violent predator. Someone capable of unimaginable crimes. As the report ended, I kept thinking about my employee. I kept thinking about that night. About how closely he had followed her. About what might have happened if nobody had been watching. Maybe he would have done nothing. Maybe the situation would have ended exactly the same way. But after learning who he really was, I couldn't stop wondering. Sometimes people ask whether instincts are real, whether that feeling that something isn't right should be trusted. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that from the moment I saw that man, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't explain it now. But when his face appeared on the news a week later, every uneasy feeling I'd had about him suddenly made perfect sense. To this day, he's the only customer I've ever met who genuinely terrified me after I learned who he really was. Because the most disturbing part wasn't that he looked dangerous. It was that he looked completely normal. One of the most disturbing experiences of my life happened when I was younger, and even now, years later, I still think about it almost every day. At the time, I belonged to a large friend group. There were around 20 of us altogether, 5 boys and 15 girls. We were incredibly close and spent nearly all of our free time together. Despite how close we were, none of us were dating. We were simply a group of best friends who loved hanging out and finding new adventures. One weekend, someone came up with what seemed like an amazing idea. We should spend a night at the Field Museum in Chicago. After a lot of planning, we managed to arrange a special visit during evening hours. We were excited beyond belief. Most of us had visited museums before during the day, but being inside one after dark felt completely different. The museum itself was already impressive during normal hours. At night, it felt like an entirely different world. The massive halls seemed larger. The shadows appeared deeper. The exhibits looked strangely alive in the dim lighting. At first, everything was exciting. We explored different sections of the museum, joked around, took pictures, and enjoyed the unique experience of having access to such a huge place after hours. As the evening went on, darkness settled outside. The atmosphere changed. The museum became quieter. Every footstep echoed through the hallways. The distant sounds of movement carried much farther than they normally would. That's when someone suggested a game, hide and seek. Looking back, it was probably the worst idea we could have had. At the time, however, it sounded fun. With 20 people and an enormous building full of exhibits, hallways, staircases, and hidden corners, it seemed like the perfect place to play. We chose one person to be the seeker. Everyone else scattered. The moment the countdown began, people sprinted in every direction. Some ran upstairs, others disappeared into lower levels. A few ducked behind exhibits and displays. Within seconds, most of the group had vanished from sight. I headed toward the north entrance area to find a hiding spot. One of the girls came with me, and together we searched for a place where we wouldn't easily be found. As we moved through the museum, I remember feeling how surreal everything seemed. The exhibits towered above us. Ancient artifacts cast strange shadows across the floor. The silence felt different than it did during the day. It was the kind of silence that makes you instinctively lower your voice. For a while, everything seemed normal. Occasionally, we could hear distant footsteps or laughter from other members of the group. Sometimes we heard someone running through another section of the museum. It all felt like part of the game. Then, we heard a scream. A girl's scream. It echoed through the building. Loud, sudden, terrified, the sound froze both of us in place. For a moment, neither of us moved. The scream had sounded real, not playful, not like someone joking around. It sounded genuinely frightened. We looked at each other. Neither of us knew what to do. Then the silence returned. No second scream, no shouting. Nothing. Eventually, we left our hiding spot and started searching for the others. As we moved through the museum, we noticed something strange. The building suddenly felt empty. Far too empty. We expected to find our friends laughing somewhere or hiding nearby. Instead, many of the hallways were completely deserted. The excitement from earlier had disappeared. A growing sense of unease settled over us. One by one, members of the group began emerging from different parts of the museum. Everyone seemed confused. Several people had heard the scream. Others hadn't heard it at all. Nobody could identify who it had come from. At first, we assumed whoever screamed had simply become scared during the game. But as more people gathered together, a much larger problem became obvious. Not everyone had returned. We started counting. Once, twice, then again. The number never changed. There were only 16 of us. 4 people were missing. At first, nobody panicked. We assumed they were still hiding somewhere. After all, the museum was huge. Maybe they hadn't realized the game was over. Maybe they couldn't hear us calling. So we searched. We split into groups and checked every area we could access. We called their names repeatedly. No response. We searched again. Still nothing. The longer we looked, the more frightened everyone became. Eventually, the reality of the situation began sinking in. 4 members of our group had completely vanished. The excitement from earlier was gone. Now everyone was terrified. Museum staff were notified immediately. The police were called. Soon, what had started as a harmless game turned into a full-scale search. Officers searched the museum. Staff searched the museum. Security personnel reviewed areas throughout the building. Every room, hallway, exhibit area, staircase, and accessible section was checked. The search continued for hours. Nothing, no sign of them, no clues, no explanation. It was as if they had simply disappeared. The following days were a blur. Investigators interviewed everyone. Questions were asked over and over again. Where had we last seen them? What were they wearing? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Had anyone seen them leave? The answer was always the same. No, nobody knew. No one had seen where they went. No one had watched them leave. No one could explain what happened. As days turned into weeks, hope slowly began fading. Search efforts continued, but no evidence was ever found. No trace, no sightings, nothing. The 4 friends who entered that museum with us were never located. Years have passed since that night. We've all grown older. Most of us moved on with our lives as best we could, but none of us ever truly forgot. Every now and then, I'll hear something about missing persons cases and find myself thinking about them again. I still remember all 20 of us arriving together. I remember the excitement, the laughter, the anticipation of spending the night inside such an incredible building. I remember running through those dark museum halls, convinced we were about to have the best night of our lives. Instead, it became the night that changed everything. What haunts me most isn't the scream. It isn't the dark hallways or the eerie atmosphere of the museum after hours. It's the uncertainty. Not knowing what happened. Not having answers. Not knowing whether those 4 friends survived, escaped somehow, or encountered something none of us can explain. Even now, whenever I think back to that night, I find myself asking the same question I've been asking for years. What happened to them after we heard that scream? Because despite all the searches, all the investigations, and all the years that have passed, nobody has ever been able to answer it. This story happened to me and one of my friends a few years ago. And even now, whenever we talk about it, we still can't completely explain what happened that night. At the time, it genuinely felt like we were either about to be kidnapped or chased down by someone hiding in the darkness. Looking back, we can laugh about parts of it, but in the moment, we were absolutely terrified. My friend and I used to go on late-night bike rides all the time. It had become a regular thing for us. Whenever we were bored, especially during the warmer months, we would grab our bikes and head out after dark. At first, those rides felt exciting and a little scary, but after doing them so often, we became comfortable with them. We knew the routes well and never really expected anything unusual to happen. One of our favorite places to ride was a reservoir located several miles away from town. Getting there required traveling along a long, isolated trail that cut through open fields. The trail itself wasn't actually that long. It probably only took about 10 minutes to ride through. However, those 10 minutes always felt much longer because of how dark and remote it was. The trail was surrounded by fields on both sides, with almost no houses, streetlights, or signs of civilization nearby. Once you entered it, the world seemed to disappear behind you. On moonless nights, the darkness was so thick that it felt almost solid. Sometimes it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Even though we had ridden through that trail many times before, it was always the part that made me uneasy. There was something about being completely surrounded by darkness that made your imagination start working against you. Every strange sound suddenly seemed important. Every shadow looked suspicious. That night started no differently than any other ride. We met up in the evening, grabbed our bikes, and headed toward the reservoir. We joked around as we rode and talked about random things. Nothing felt unusual at all. After making our way through the dark trail, we eventually reached the road that led toward the reservoir. From there, we still had another short stretch to travel. Unfortunately, that section was just as dark as the first trail. The reservoir itself sat in a fairly isolated area. Thick bushes and overgrown brush surrounded most of it. There was a small chain-link fence around parts of the area, but much of it was hidden behind vegetation. The bushes were incredibly dense. You couldn't simply walk through them. If someone or something was inside, you would never be able to see it. One thing I always remembered about that reservoir was the pair of swans that lived there. Every time we visited, they seemed to be around. We had actually been chased by them once before, which had become a running joke between us. Near the edge of the water was a small concrete platform. To reach it, you had to walk down a set of stairs, then up another short section, and finally down again until you reached the water's edge. It was an oddly designed place, but it gave you a decent view of the reservoir. The problem was that once you got down there at night, you could barely see anything. There was a faint light somewhere in the distance that provided just enough illumination to make out shapes and outlines, but not much more. Most of the area remained hidden in darkness. Luckily, I had brought a powerful flashlight with me. It wasn't professional grade or anything, but it was strong enough to light up sections of the shoreline and nearby bushes. When we arrived, we parked our bikes and walked down to the platform. Everything seemed normal. The water was calm, the air was still. The only sounds came from insects and the occasional movement of water. I switched on my flashlight and slowly scanned the area. The beam swept across the water, over the bushes, and eventually landed on the two swans floating nearby. As soon as we saw them, we started laughing about the time they had chased us before. We sat there joking around, shining the flashlight toward them every now and then. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then we heard a strange sound. One of the swans let out a honk, but it didn't sound normal. At first, neither of us thought much of it. We just looked at each other and laughed awkwardly. "That sounded weird," my friend said. "It did," I replied. There was something unusual about it. The sound didn't seem to come from the swans directly in front of us. Instead, it sounded farther away, much farther away than it should have been. I remember feeling a strange sense of unease immediately afterward. The entire area suddenly felt different. We both fell quiet. A few seconds later, we heard it again. The same strange honk echoed through the darkness. This time, however, it was accompanied by another sound. A loud metallic rattling. It sounded like someone was violently shaking the chain-link fence hidden behind the thick brush. The noise erupted suddenly and loudly enough to make both of us jump. The sound wasn't subtle. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal brushing against it. It sounded exactly like someone grabbing the fence with both hands and shaking it as hard as possible. The rattling continued for several seconds before stopping. The silence that followed felt even worse. My friend looked directly at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us had to say much. We both knew we wanted to leave immediately. Without another word, we grabbed our bikes and started heading back toward the stairs. Normally, we would have taken our time, but not that night. We carefully carried our bikes down the steps and back toward the path as quickly as we could. The second we reached the dark trail leading away from the reservoir, I shoved my flashlight into my pocket. I didn't even bother using it. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there as fast as possible. Instead of riding our bikes, we started running alongside them. The darkness around us suddenly felt much more threatening than before. Every shadow looked like someone standing there. Every rustle in the bushes made us glance over our shoulders. About halfway through the short journey back toward the road, there was a brightly lit parking lot off to the side. A building sat near the edge of the lot, and a fence connected the parking area to the darker section of the path. Compared to everything around it, the parking lot almost looked comforting, because it was one of the few places with proper lighting. As we approached it, I remember feeling relieved. At least we would be able to see what was around us. Then something happened that neither of us has ever forgotten. Through the fence, in the bright light of the parking lot, we saw what appeared to be a completely naked man sprinting across the area. Not jogging, not walking, sprinting, full speed. The figure moved from one side of the lot to the other before disappearing behind the building. For a second, neither of us said anything. We simply stared. I remember stopping briefly because I wasn't entirely sure what I had just seen. Then my friend looked at me. I looked back at him. "We're dead," I said with a nervous laugh. It was meant as a joke, but neither of us found it funny. The truth was that we were both scared. There was no other route back. If someone was hiding around that building, we would have to pass directly beside it. For a moment, I almost hoped we would see somebody standing there. At least then we would know what we were dealing with. The uncertainty was worse. We slowly approached the building while gripping our bikes tightly. My heart was pounding. The parking lot was brightly lit. The building was right there. The corner where the figure had disappeared was only a few feet away, and yet when we got there was nobody. No naked man. No person hiding behind the building. No movement. Nothing. The entire area was empty. That somehow felt even more unsettling. Where had he gone? There wasn't enough time for someone to disappear completely. Yet he was nowhere to be seen. At that point, we stopped pretending to stay calm. We broke into a full sprint, bikes beside us, legs pumping as fast as possible. We raced toward the road ahead. The moment we reached the illuminated roadway, both of us slowed down slightly. For the first time since leaving the reservoir, I felt a wave of relief. We had made it. We were out of the darkness. Whatever had been back there was now behind us. I looked at my friend. He looked at me. We both smiled nervously. Then, we heard it, the same strange honk, the exact same sound. It echoed from the direction of the reservoir, a sound that didn't quite resemble a swan and didn't quite resemble a goose. It sounded almost like someone trying to imitate one. Our smiles vanished instantly. We turned toward the reservoir. In the distance, illuminated only by the faint light near the platform where we had been sitting earlier, we saw movement. A figure, a human-shaped figure, running, fast, running directly toward us. For a split second, neither of us moved. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Then, survival instincts took over. We jumped onto our bikes. I don't think I've ever mounted a bike faster in my life. The second my feet hit the pedals, I started riding as hard as I could. My friend was right beside me. Neither of us looked back. We just rode. Faster and faster. The wind rushed past us as we put as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever was behind us. Eventually, after several minutes, we finally slowed down. By then, we were far away from the reservoir, far away from the trail, far away from the darkness. Neither of us said much during the ride home. We were both trying to process everything that had happened. To this day, I still don't know what we heard. I don't know who was shaking the fence. I don't know who or what we saw running through that parking lot. And I definitely don't know what was running toward us from the reservoir. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone was messing with us. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe fear caused our minds to exaggerate certain details. But at the time, it felt incredibly real. The fear we experienced wasn't imagined. It was the kind of fear that makes your stomach drop and your heart race, the kind that convinces you something is terribly wrong even when you can't explain why. We never returned to that reservoir after that night. Not once. Even though years have passed, that experience remains one of the strangest and most frightening moments either of us has ever experienced. These days, whenever we bring it up, we usually end up laughing. We joke about the naked man, the strange honking noise, and how fast we ran with our bikes. But beneath the laughter, there's still a part of us that remembers exactly how terrifying it felt. And every now and then, when I think about that dark trail, the rattling fence, and the figure sprinting through the darkness, I still wonder what would have happened if we had stayed there just a little bit longer. This happened a few years ago when I was still in middle school. Even now, I don't remember every detail perfectly, which honestly makes the whole experience even stranger. Some parts of that night are blurry, almost like pieces of a dream, while other moments remain stuck in my mind as clearly as if they happened yesterday. For years, I have tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for what I saw. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. But no matter how many times I go over the memory, there is one thing I can't shake. The fear I felt that night was real, and whatever I saw felt real too. At the time, I was living with my family in a fairly ordinary house. Nothing unusual had ever happened there before. It wasn't an old house with a creepy history, and it wasn't the kind of place people would describe as haunted. It was just a normal home, where I felt safe. Like most kids my age, I had a routine. I would spend my days at school, come home, do homework if I had any, play video games, watch TV, and eventually go to bed. There was nothing special about the night this happened. As far as I can remember, it was completely normal. I went to sleep like I always did. At some point during the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I don't know what time it was exactly. I never checked a clock. The entire house was quiet, and judging by how dark everything was, it had to be very late. I remember feeling extremely groggy. You know that feeling when you wake up unexpectedly and your brain hasn't fully caught up yet? Your body is awake, but your mind still feels half asleep. That was exactly how I felt. For a few moments, I just lay there staring into the darkness of my room. Everything seemed normal. The house was silent. No voices. No sounds from outside. Nothing unusual at all. After a minute or two, I realized I was thirsty. I decided to get up and grab some water from the kitchen. It seemed like the simplest thing in the world. I climbed out of bed and slowly made my way toward my bedroom door. Even now, I can remember how cold the floor felt under my feet. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The hallway wasn't completely dark. A small amount of light was coming from somewhere farther down the house. It wasn't bright enough to fully illuminate the area, but it created a faint glow that allowed me to make out basic shapes and outlines. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. I started walking toward the kitchen. Then something happened. Halfway down the hallway, I suddenly stopped. I can't fully explain why. I didn't hear a noise. I didn't see anything unusual right away. But all at once, I felt something. It was that strange feeling you get when you suddenly realize you aren't alone. A feeling that makes every hair on your body stand up. A feeling that tells you something is wrong before your eyes even confirm it. The moment it hit me, I froze. My entire body became tense. I remember standing perfectly still in the hallway, afraid to move. My heart began beating faster. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had just woken up. I was tired. Maybe my imagination was running wild, but the feeling only got stronger. It felt like someone was standing behind me, watching me. I slowly turned my head, and that's when I saw it. Because of the dim light in the hallway, I could make out a figure standing several feet behind me. At first, my brain struggled to understand what I was looking at. It wasn't a person I recognized. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't anyone who should have been in the house. The figure was unusually tall. That was the first thing I noticed. It seemed much taller than any normal person. Even years later, that's still one of the details I remember most clearly. The height. It looked impossibly tall. The figure wasn't standing in a threatening pose. It wasn't moving toward me. It was simply standing there. Watching, the darkness made it difficult to see specific details. Its features were hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't see eyes. I couldn't see clothing clearly. It was almost like looking at a silhouette, a dark shape standing in the hallway. The second thing I noticed was what appeared to be some kind of hat. Even now, I struggle to describe it. It wasn't like a baseball cap. It wasn't a beanie. It almost looked like a wide-brimmed hat, but I'm honestly not sure. The shape above its head was strange and distinct enough that it immediately stood out to me. I remember staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to believe it was something ordinary. Maybe a coat, hanging somewhere. Maybe a trick of the light. Maybe furniture casting an unusual shadow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what I was looking at. The figure felt real. It had presence. The kind of presence that makes your stomach drop instantly. As soon as I saw it, fear rushed through my entire body. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think clearly. For what was probably only a few seconds, I stood there completely frozen. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there. Watching, the silence somehow made everything worse. If it had moved, maybe my brain could have processed it differently. If it had spoken, maybe I could have understood what was happening. Instead, there was only silence. And that silence felt terrifying. I don't remember every detail that happened next. In fact, most of it is a blur. Fear has a strange way of affecting memory. Some moments become crystal clear while others completely disappear. The next thing I clearly remember is panic taking over. Every survival instinct in my body suddenly activated. I turned around and ran. I sprinted back toward my bedroom as fast as I could. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. My heart felt like it was trying to explode out of my chest. The hallway that had seemed normal only moments earlier now felt endless. Every step felt slower than it should have. I remember throwing open my bedroom door and practically diving onto my bed. Without hesitation, I pulled the blankets over my head. Looking back, it sounds childish. But when you're that scared, logic disappears. All I wanted was a barrier between me and whatever I had seen. I buried myself beneath the covers and squeezed my eyes shut. I remember trying desperately not to think about the figure. not to imagine it standing outside my door, not to imagine it walking down the hallway, not to imagine it staring at me from the darkness. The harder I tried not to think about it, the more impossible it became. Every tiny sound in the house suddenly seemed important. A creaking floorboard, the settling of the walls, the hum of distant appliances. Everything sounded amplified. I stayed completely still. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to peek out from beneath the blankets, too afraid to check whether anything was still there. At some point, exhaustion eventually won. I forced myself to go back to sleep. Or maybe I simply passed out from fear. I honestly don't know. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was pouring through my window. Everything looked normal again. The fear from the night before felt distant, almost unreal. For a brief moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The memory felt different from a dream. It felt like something I had actually experienced. Over the years, I have told this story to friends countless times. Almost every single person has had the same reaction. Most of them don't believe me. Some laugh. Some tell me I was dreaming. Others say I was hallucinating because I had just woken up. A few people have suggested sleep paralysis, even though I was able to move. Everyone seems to have an explanation. And honestly, maybe they're right. Maybe there is a completely logical reason for what happened. Maybe my tired brain misinterpreted shadows in the hallway. Maybe I was still partially asleep. Maybe my imagination filled in details that weren't really there. I understand why people think that. If someone else told me this story, I would probably consider those possibilities too. But the reason this memory has stayed with me for so many years is because of how real it felt. The fear wasn't dreamlike. The feeling of being watched wasn't dreamlike. The image of that impossibly tall figure standing behind me wasn't dreamlike. Everything about it felt real. Even now, years later, I occasionally think about that night. I think about the hallway, the dim light, the silence, and that dark figure standing motionless behind me. I still wonder what I actually saw. Maybe it was nothing more than my imagination. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my brain created something out of shadows and exhaustion. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever the truth is, one thing has never changed. I can still remember the overwhelming feeling of dread that washed over me the moment I turned around. And to this day, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night and walk through a dark hallway, a small part of me still expects to see that tall shadow standing there, silently watching from the darkness.